It's such a powerful weekend. It's such a powerful weekend in the life of our nation. I hope that we will not miss the synergy between the celebration of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the second inauguration of Barack Obama as our president. As King reminds us, the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. This is a weekend to celebrate our large and small achievements as a nation, and a day to pray and recommit to work for racial equality and justice in our nation, in our neighborhood, in our congregation. How good it is to observe our worship together on this day, and to open the many doors in the church which need to be opened. This is also the year, and it's a squeaky door. This is also the year and the month in which we celebrate the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Did you know that? Did you know that it was signed by Abraham Lincoln 150 years ago, this month, on January 1st, 1863? The historian John Hope Franklin describes that day in Washington that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation as a bright, crispy day, maybe like today, in our nation's capital. Because it was New Year's Day, there was a reception at the White House, and many folks came, folks from the Army and from the Navy, and then the ordinary citizens were also invited to come in and shake Lincoln's hand. Hundreds of folks were present for that event, and as was the custom in those days, and I also believe in these days, Lincoln had to shake every single hand. On that day, January 1st, 1863, he stood for nearly 3 hours, shaking hands and chatting folks up. He was a little on edge. He knew that following that reception, he would be signing the proclamation, and as his guests departed, he went upstairs to sign it with only a few of his friends. The story goes that as the proclamation was put in front of him, Lincoln held a pen and attempted to put it to paper, but his arm was shaking so badly from all the hands that he had shaken that it made him feel superstitious. He couldn't remember that his hand might be shaky because he had shaken all those hands, and then he stopped and he thought, am I anxious about actually signing this document? But then he remembered. And he remembered why his signature was so shaky. And the story goes that he laughed to himself and went ahead and signed it anyway. If you look at his signature on the Emancipation Proclamation, you might see a little bit of a jiggle. We think of the Emancipation Proclamation as the act that freed the slaves. In reality, however, it did not free all the slaves. It only freed those in parts of the Confederacy that were in rebellion against the Union. These slaves, behind Confederate lines, would not be part of the proclamation because it could not be enforced in the South. The war was still raging, and of course, slaves were not free in the Confederacy. At Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, Henry Ward Beecher, along with many folks in the North, preached that the proclamation may not free a single slave. Everyone was aware that it most likely was not going to be a massive event freeing the slaves, but that this event, the proclamation, gives liberty a moral recognition. Lincoln knew when he signed it that the proclamation had a limited effect, but he also was convinced that it was, as he wrote, an act of justice. And that act of justice made way for the 13th Amendment 2 years later, which outlawed slavery altogether. Although Lincoln knew that the proclamation itself did not accomplish all that he hoped for, and finally, of course, gave his life for, Lincoln also knew and believed that inch by inch, and with quiet determination, he would move our nation forward into justice and equality. An act of justice, he believed, no matter how small or seemingly inconsequential or insignificant, is an act of justice. 100 years later, in 1963, Martin Luther King was just getting started. And all around him, people were quietly going about their lives, performing small acts of justice. Rosa Parks, small act of justice, refused to give her seat up on a bus. The white lunch counter at Woolworth's became a place of challenge for integration. Hotel lobbies and front desks became quiet battlegrounds throughout the South. And folks up north were buying bus tickets to the South like mad so that they could demonstrate. It was a time of challenge and change and another step forward in our country's struggle to be free of racial inequity and tyranny. Do you feel in your life that you don't make a difference? That the problems you face and we face as a nation are so huge and our power to change them so limited? Do you hunger in your life to see the world as a more just and loving place for all God's children? Our issues appear enormous before us. Gun violence and the lack of proper control. A Congress bent on impeding legislation instead of enacting it. Difficult environmental issues such as global warming and sustainability. The ever-widening and deepening gap between rich and poor. Immigration issues. A rising prison population and an educational system which is failing our children and therefore failing our future. If we were to actually comprehend the long list of concerns that is before us as a country and as a community, we might throw in the towel before we even begin. Our careful longing for justice pales in contrast to that mighty list. But I'm fascinated by the strength of ordinary people to take small steps forward into justice and love. Lincoln was extraordinary. We know that. But he knew, too, how to go about the daily and persistent work of freeing slaves by taking steps, sometimes tiny steps, that would lead forward into freedom and justice. Would that our leaders today have the courage and the humanity of an Abraham Lincoln. He knew that each small act of justice would stack on top of the next one, and that through steady determination and quiet courage, he could lead the nation into a new day. James Weldon Johnson, the wonderful poet whose song we sung this morning, captures the thorny road ahead in this poem, parts of which also are reflected in this morning's hymn. Oh, brothers mine, sisters too, today we stand where half a century sweeps our ken, since God, through Lincoln's steady hand, struck our bonds and made us men. This land is ours by right of birth. This land is ours by right of toil. We help to turn its virgin earth. Our sweat is in its fruitful soil. Stand erect and live without fear, and for our foes let this suffice. We've bought our sonship here, and we have more than paid the price. That for which millions prayed and sighed, that for which tens of thousands fought, for which so many freely died, God cannot let it come to naught. Our scripture this morning reminds us that Zacchaeus was a wee little man. We all know the song. I've always thought of Zacchaeus as being one of small stature, perhaps even a little person, as we call them today. But it also occurs to me that he might have been a person who was small of heart, lacking in courage to do the things in his life that he knew would make a difference in his own life or help somebody. Perhaps his life had become so small and so unimportant that he was willing to just climb up a tree to catch a glimpse of someone who might help him move into a bigger place, into a wider world, into a stronger, more movable place in his heart. Perhaps Zacchaeus lives in each one of us. We feel small in the world sometimes, and therefore we feel often unable, maybe even helpless, to make the enormous changes that will help make the world a kinder and more just and loving place. The story reminds us that God finds a way. God finds a way to work in every life so that we can move into the world with the strength of God's justice and love. Jesus looks up and tells Zacchaeus, today, salvation will come to your house. By a single small act, the act of gathering up some gumption to climb up into a tree, salvation came to a house. Now I know that not all of us are called to be president, and we can be grateful for that. And not all of us are a Lincoln or a Martin Luther King or a John Hope Franklin or a Rosa Parks. But each one of us is quite capable of being a Zacchaeus. Each one of us can climb a tree or simply open our hearts to affect love and justice, to open ourselves to the thought and the need and the desire for salvation to come to the house. In his strong sermon, Drum Major Instinct, preached in February of 1968, almost exactly 2 months before his death, King reminded the congregation of a new form of greatness that comes to us from the Gospels. King understood the need for every person to offer what they had, the powerful and the powerless, big shots and small fries, those who lived in shacks and those who lived in high rises, all to work on behalf of justice. He knew that in order to transform a nation, every single human soul needed to be involved. He also knew that we weren't going to move forward unless we claimed the heart of the servant and the soul of Jesus as we work together. King said, if you want to be important, wonderful. And if you want to be recognized, great. But everybody can be great because everybody can serve. You don't need a college degree to serve. You don't need to make your subject and your verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love. And you can be a servant. He ended that sermon with a humble statement of faith, a statement of faith that we might all want to make in our lives. He said, yes, Jesus, I want to be on your right side and on your left side, not for any selfish reason. I want to be on your right or your left side, not for a political kingdom or for ambition. I just want to be there in love and justice and in truth and in commitment to others, so that we can make of this old world a new world. King knew, as Lincoln, that thousands and thousands of acts of justice would add up to make a big change in our nation and in the heart of humanity. He saw himself as a man, an ordinary man, who had a heart burning for justice. But I wonder today if he knew he would make such a huge difference by the things that he did, if he knew that we would be thinking about him today. As he said many times, and he said it simply, and he said it profoundly, I just want to do God's will. He was certain in a deep place that a heart full of grace and a soul filled with love could open us up to a new road. Today, we are walking on that road, and we know we've got miles and miles ahead. So on this day, let us all, small and mighty, black and white, liberal and conservative, up in a tree or down in a valley, wealthy or impoverished, all of us, as a congregation and as a nation, use this day and all the days ahead to generate hearts full of grace, souls generated and guided by love. Amen.